Lawrence Lee joining us from Valletta to first tell us about the agreement that was signed, Lawrence.
Well, yes, at this point, I do wonder, now that it's finished, whether Europe's leaders actually think that they've achieved anything particularly remarkable. Perhaps they thought it would be fairly easy. Maybe they thought Africa would roll over the prospects of a couple of $1 billion and some vague promises of economic development, and in return, Africa would help bring back economic migrants to Africa from Europe and better police its own borders. Maybe they thought that was a simple enough thing and enough money. But what happened was that Africa pushed back really hard, and leader after leader tried to change the conversation to one which went into a much deeper dialogue to do with the historical, political and economic relationship between Africa and Europe. And in the end, Europe couldn't get agreement on the key issue of repatriation. So what you had in the end was an action plan very long on vague promises, but very short on concrete action.
Welcome to the signing ceremony of the agreement to the...
So this is Europe's offer to Africa, $2 billion in cash, about a tenth of what Europe provides in aid every year, signed solemnly by the EU's leaders. In return, they expect African nations to help repatriate many thousands who Europe sees as economic migrants rather than refugees. Even Hungary's Prime Minister signed it, even with something of a smirk, but he had already made clear what many Europeans think: Africans should be made to stay out of Europe.
Migration is not a win-win situation for those countries from where they are coming and they arrive, but rather it's a lose-lose situation, and we don't speak openly about it. So we should change the language of the discussions and do not consider migration as a positive thing, because it's totally against the impression of the European citizens.
Yet as Africa's leaders arrived, it became clear just how large the gap was between what Europe is offering and what Africa says it needs. They demand entire reform of the economic relationship between the two continents on crucial issues like agriculture, in which Western giants have undermined local economies. Based on that, €2 billion look to many like chicken feed.
It's not enough. €1.8 billion is far from enough. The needs are far greater. That's why we have requested our partners to participate more money. And above that, we don't just want aid, we want reform.
It's become abundantly clear just how differently Europe and Africa see the refugee crisis. While Europeans increasingly make no distinction between asylum seekers and economic migrants, African leaders here in Malta have reminded their hosts how much of the world Europeans colonised for money. In a way, holding out against Europe on all this looks a little like revenge. African countries traditionally have found themselves overpowered in trade negotiations by European money and influence, but not here, because the African delegations here knew that for once this was not a crisis for Africa, but a crisis for Europe, and that seems to have given them courage to demand more. And so when the leaks emerged of the action plan, there was but scant mention of what the Europeans wanted most: African help in repatriations. Africa was getting its own back.
I think they're hoping that this will be a start of a longer-term engagement where Europe gives something and gets something in return. But no, absolutely, one cannot say that they've achieved this goal, and this goal was definitely one of the main planks of what European negotiators came here for today.
Perhaps you could say all this is the start of something better for Africa. Perhaps some hope might come out of all the tragedies. But if Europe is genuine about wanting Africans not to come, it will take more than what was on offer here. Lawrence Lee, Al Jazeera.
Lawrence, and you know, just away from the politics for just a moment, because there are stories behind each refugee that actually tries to make their way through Africa into Europe, and that still continues. So where does this go on to from here?
Well, I can't see the human story ending, to be honest about it. $2 billion, really nothing. Even European leaders said so. They give $20 billion a year in aid, and self-evidently that does nothing to stop people trying to come across. But there was nothing in anything that Europe offered to Africa that met the demands of what African countries want properly to be able to regenerate their own economies. 50 billion is lost in tax avoidance by Western governments Western corporations in Africa every year. Unless something is done about these things, I can't really see the tide of people stopping next year.
And for African and the European leaders over in Malta, what do they do next?
Well, on one level, I think there's a push for some bilateral agreements to be met, which could be very secret and may lead to Europe having to do deals with countries with very poor human rights record. But the other thing I just want to mention very briefly that happened after the summit finished was an informal meeting between the European Union's leaders and ministers to discuss the other routes from Turkey and through Greece and the Balkans. And what they've decided is they want a summit with Turkey as soon as 10 days from now, which could lead to hundreds of millions being pumped into Turkey to stop Syrians and Iraqis from crossing into Greece. And in return, Europe may end up giving Turkish workers free visas to come and work inside Europe. So if you wanted more evidence of Europe's apparent intransigence towards people fleeing poverty and war, the suggestion now on the other route is that they would prefer to see Turkish migrant workers come into Europe than Syrians and Iraqis fleeing war and persecution.
All right, Lawrence, thank you for that update from Valletta.